Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoominar from UC San Diego. It is January 21st, 2025 in San Diego, which makes it January 22nd in not only Japan, but also Seoul, where our speaker is today. Michael Beeman is with me. While we're waiting to have the Zoom audience find their seats, let me just take a few minutes to introduce our school to those of you who are new to the Japan Zoominar. I'm Ulrike Schade. I'm a professor of Japanese business and the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. This whole thing finds you at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We are an international relations and public policy school with the numbers that you can see here, including 8 degrees, one of which is a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center. We do a lot of fun things. Our website is jfit.ucsd.edu. Our events are recorded, and that has two implications. The first is you are invited to type your questions for our speaker today in the chat, and I will try to weave it into our conversation. If I call your question out, I will refer to you only by your first name to ensure your privacy. Recording also means that we have a whole list of recordings. You can find those in the JZ gallery at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. And they're ordered there by politics and economics and so forth and so on. It looks like that on the right-hand side. So you can find all of our recordings there. Our winter schedule looks like this. Last 2 weeks ago, we had Philip Lipsky. His recording is up now. We talked about U.S.-Japan relations in a changing international order. And of course, today we have Michael Beeman, who I'll introduce momentarily. And on February 22nd, 22nd, I have Brad Glosserman with me, who will interview me on my new book titled Japan Reemerges. All right, and with that, I'm going to now start our event today. And the book we're going to talk about, and make this a little bit larger here, is Michael's new book titled Walking Out, America's New Trade Policy in the Asia-Pacific and Beyond. And let me stop this so I can introduce our speaker, Michael. Good morning to Seoul. Thank you for joining us first thing in the morning in Korea.
Hello, San Diego. Congratulations on your book, and it's really wonderful to be with you and to be on the Zoominar.
Thank you. So let me introduce you. For those of you who don't know Dr. Michael Beeman, he is a career trade person. I think, Michael, if I did this right, I counted that you've spent the last 25 years in trade one way or another. Specifically, I looked this up. I hope I get this right. From 2017 to 2023, Michael was the assistant U.S. trade representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC. And as such, he was in charge of the U.S.-Japan trade agreement at the time, various, maybe in the plural, and the U.S.-Korea trade agreement. From 2007 to 2017, so the previous 10 years, he had held various positions in the USTR, including Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan. Prior to that, Michael was at the World Bank in a variety of positions, ranging from international trade specialist to advisor to the U.S. executive director. So all told, I think that's 25 years. Before that, Michael has studied at various places, including Harvard, the University of Tokyo. He was a Fulbright scholar. His degrees are an MA from Johns Hopkins SAIS. That's our competitor in DC, but you're forgiven because I think that was before we even existed. And he holds a PhD from the University of Oxford in politics, and recently spent some time at APARC. This is Stanford's Asia Pacific Research Center, I guess it is, as a visiting scholar and a lecturer. And he's written this book, which is about the radical shifts in America's trade policies since the 2010s. So we're going back, we're going to go back 15, 20 years of what I might call beggar thy neighbor version 2.0. You don't call it like that in the book, but you mentioned that it hasn't been like this since the
Hmm.
turn of the previous century. So with that, let me stop talking and give you the microphone, and then we'll have a conversation after you tell us what's in the book. And of course, today, one more thing for as introduction. It's an auspicious day today. It's day 2 of the second Trump administration, and President Trump has signed a large number, 23, I believe, separate assessments and reviews. And we're not going to go into the weeds of this, but we're going to take a larger picture of what all of that means. So thank you, Michael, for joining me. It's great to have you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Thank you. And hello to everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's a wonderful thing that we are able to connect like this. Let me just talk a little bit about just the really thumbnail sketch of the book and its conclusions, because I think it really helps set the context for what everyone is seeing in the news today and what you'll see in the news tomorrow, and probably what you'll see in the news 6 years from now. So, like it or not, this is where we are. Um, so I wrote the book. I left USTR, as you mentioned, in early 2023 to because I was hearing a lot of well, first of all, I thought I could be potentially more effective on the outside than I was on the inside at that point of government. I had a wonderful career at USTR. It's a very special place with very special people. But it was an opportunity to try and explain and try and help others understand what was going on with U.S. trade policy, which is a pretty momentous, I think historically we'll look back and we'll say this is a pretty momentous moment for the United States and for the world, and what happened and where this is all going. And it actually kind of went on a journey myself because I didn't fully understand it, being in the middle of everything that was washing over Washington for several years. I tried to actually had to spend some time to make sense of it. Once I figured out what I think is a pretty convincing argument as to exactly why we as the United States are where we are, I think it will all make sense to others. So let me briefly go through that. I think as everyone well appreciates, the United States is at what Pew Research calls an exceptional level of political division and polarization in the United States, globally speaking. What this has led to, and you have the far left and the far right, which is the Trump right or the new right, and then the progressive left, which have now kind of taken over each of the parties, particularly on trade, but in many other areas, to really become the center. So we have these extremes that have kind of moved into the center, and the center has been pushed back, kind of out of sight, out of vision, out of influence. And that center was what predominated in U.S. Trade policy for 70, 75 years. But because of the polarization that is everything has gravitated toward the ends, which has become the middle, we have a different situation. But the consequences of this have been pretty profound. What we have today I think really, and this is understandable for those who live in the United States, is a very zero-sum game of politics that is going on today. That means there's no sense or desire to reach consensus on anything, because giving something to the other side, allowing them a win, whatever it is, even if it's a compromise where you get a win, is seen as a loss to yourself, your group, your cause, whatever it is. So this is what we see in the familiar gridlock in Washington over many domestic issues. And these are all fights about the status quo in the United States in one way or another, essentially. So what this has led to, and this really began to develop in the 2010s, as you say, and what it's led to is a situation where the United States no longer can agree with itself on the rules for the economy, the rules for many things, but in the trade area, the rules that were developed, passed by the Congress, principles and norms and the rest that were built on for over many decades that kind of stacked on top of one another. that the US reflected into the trading system for decades and into its own agreements for decades, there was no longer an ability to agree on many of those rules because these rules were being fought over in the United States as an issue or concern about the domestic space and the status quo in America. So these two sides are fighting over these rules. And so what this has led to really is no, consistent, dependable, reliable consensus on trade any longer. And so if the U.S. can't, one administration or the other administration may have its own idea of what those rules are, but then the next administration will come in and just cancel everything basically and go in a different direction. So this is what we see, which is familiar in the one hand. So trade has two dimensions, and this is the domestic dimension that I'm speaking about. So we have a lot of proxy wars going on in the domestic space that are causing this difficulty when it comes to trade. However, there's a surprising and maybe alignment or consensus, some are trying to say now, in the external dimension of trade, which is obviously trade, what trade means for America as a country to country kind of trade. So it's not just about the rules for trade. Some of it's about the rules, but a lot of it's about this concept that the U.S. is losing on trade. So zero sum means if others are gaining and we have a trade deficit, that's just a simple example of other examples, then we are losing to others, and therefore there's a need to stem the harm from that loss. And it's a sense that on both sides, the progressive left and the new right, that that trade has become a matter of a greater harm than it is of opportunity for America. And so what that does is flip the whole vision for President Roosevelt's vision for the international trading system, the rules-based approach, on its head, because the whole rules-based approach counts on a number of important points. One is a belief that trade is a positive contribution to those countries that make commitments, to agree to obligations, to promote trade. And once you have agreement on the rules, and trust me, this is very messy. This is what trade people do. We spend a lot of time arguing with our counterparts about whether they're being fair and the rest. So this is not a Pollyanna kind of situation, but nonetheless, by and large, over the long run, over the long term, it's all headed in this direction where you have, trade has to be is seen as a positive sum gain for those that have agreed to those rules. That and America had huge influence over what those rules were. Of course, it didn't get all the rules it wanted because it had to negotiate, but it really dominated the system and reflected its own self into the system. But now it can't agree at home on many of those rules itself, but it sees also now harm in kind of a zero-sum way in trade when it comes to trade with foreign nations. So this is really the fundamental kind of crux of everything that you see coming out of Washington for the last, I would say at least 15 years on trade. And obviously, the kind of galvanizing moment for all this, while these undercurrents were very swift and were very aggressive on trying to redirect U.S. trade policy, it was really galvanized, obviously, with the, I think we can all say, kind of surprise win of President Trump in 2016, the election of 2016. So what does that mean? What it means is the U.S., to the extent that there is a trade policy in the United States, there are two things going on. One is this kind of negative, well, for those who support the old approach, it would be seen as a sort of a negative energy coming on the need to kind of wall off America, to stem the harm from trade in whatever shape that is. It could be preferential subsidies, which, I believe just, are flat out walking, talking WTO violations by and large. But, because I say that because, as a trade official, if other countries had done that, I would immediately be in their face for the same things and making the same arguments and standing up for the U.S. and what U.S. companies, would be denied those opportunities. Um, it's that kind of thing on the one hand, but on the other hand, you get this flip flopping that's going on. So you get hundreds of 100 or however many executive orders on day one, and not just in trade, but everywhere, canceling everything that just happened basically because you can't build anymore on rules, norms, and principles and through consensus. Instead, you have to win. And this goes for both sides. This is not a one side thing. And so everyone is trying to, to reset what what the other side wants, and these fights over the status quo continue. So that is the state of matters today. So if there's any interest in digging in deeper, that's the place to go. But I think it really tees up, and I'm very satisfied with my conclusions, because here we are in this new world, and it's a familiar world because I worked through the first Trump administration, and have a clear sense of many of the objectives, the thinking, the ideas, the concerns that predominate and now are reflected in this executive order. There was one yesterday that focused on trade, which did call for 23 different desk studies by the federal bureaucracy in one way or another to kind of set the table, if you will, or set the future course of what was going to happen in Trump 2.0. A lot of those issues, almost all of them in one way or another, are very, very familiar to me from my first time around go at the trade policy in the first administration. So let's switch briefly to Japan. Obviously, the relationship that former Prime Minister Abe was able to develop with President Trump, I think everyone knows was a pretty important guidepost for how that relationship played out. I think other leaders across the world were pretty jealous of how that all went, and didn't understand how it was possible to have that relationship. But on trade, even as I mentioned in the book, from the earliest, really literally today, if it were 8 years ago, the first full day, essentially, I think it was the first full day, maybe it was the second full day, it was very clear that the administration wanted to negotiate with Japan. So I knew, as of someone responsible for Japan, and similar situation for Korea, they wanted to renegotiate course. I knew right off the bat that this is where they were headed, and needed to prepare for it. And Japan, I think, had a clear sense of what this was and was preparing for it itself. They were very indignant, I will say, certain bureaucrats in particular, that the president had withdrawn from TPP. And there's a whole chapter on TPP, so you can understand better why that happened in the book. And I think it was a really important galvanizing kind of debate that pushed U.S. even further in this new direction. But I won't go into that here. But nonetheless, obviously, there was a sense that they wanted to do it better. They could do it better. And they had some very clear objectives of what kind of trade agreements they wanted with different countries, which I also outlined in the book. Of course, Japan just wanted the U.S. to go back to TPP. They still want U.S. to go back to TPP. They spend a lot of energy and time. They spent money in Washington through think tanks and lawyers and others to try and promote this idea, and it just hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because, for a lot of reasons, but really for a lot of the reasons I outline in the book, the U.S. was just truly going in a very fundamentally different direction at that time. So anyway, obviously what this led to was a situation where there was a loss in, kind of expected market access, let's say, that TPP was going to bring, particularly in agriculture. And the agriculture sector was very, particularly not every commodity group, but virtually every commodity group is very supportive of trying to get that access to Japan. once we withdrew from TPP, that was gone. Japan then proceeded to finish its negotiations with the EU. It finished its negotiations in the RCEP, the Grand Asia Pacific Agreement, and with Australia as well. And there was a sense that this lost access was going to be a huge problem for the farm sector. So basically what happened was a political push that on Japan, and well, first of all on the White House, and then on Japan, that ended up in this trade agreement that we did with Japan, very limited tariff agreement as a kind of a phase one agreement with Japan. So all those issues are very, were my job, and I remember a lot about all that. But it went, it went pretty smoothly. There were some challenges in negotiation, but obviously it was all the focus of trying to regain access that had been, torn up when the U.S. left TPP, and then others gained that access, and American farmers and others wanted that access back. So, trade relations during that time with Japan were really centered principally on that. There was some cooperation in the space on concern with China, and we did a lot of work in that space as well. But here we are now, and virtually nothing has happened over the last 4 years except for IPEF. The trade pillar of IPEF is, there was no executive order on it, but I have a feeling it's just going to go poof at some point, if not just be ignored and not finished. And so here we are in the second Trump administration, and Japan is, if I look at this executive order issued yesterday, there's 23 different studies, as I mentioned. I counted them up. Japan is on the hook, potentially, guilty party, potentially in 7 of the 23, in one way, shape, or form, where Japan is not mentioned by name anywhere. Some are, and Japan has not been mentioned by name, but I think they're coming, and I think that the need to reset and reform U.S. trade is all going in the same direction that I outlined to you earlier. And this includes issues like the trade deficit, includes issues like unfair trade practices, and includes issues like currency practices and rates, the need to review existing trade agreements, possible new market access agreements, so potentially more positive, sort of, getting more from Japan, if you will. Application of discriminatory or extraterritorial taxes on U.S. citizens and countries is another possible area, which is not really necessarily a trade issue, a traditional trade issue. And then review of Section 232 tariffs and whether exceptions, which Japan got a lot of exceptions in the first go around, are still appropriate today. So I think there will be a very dynamic situation lining up for the coming few months. And then I think by the fall, we'll have a kind of a very clear sense of exactly where the administration wants to go and how it wants to deal with Japan. Obviously, this is affecting all of the countries and markets and everything. That is one thing I remember, and I will just end on this note, about working in USTR for the 4 years of the Trump administration, which was, I always felt that I knew too much. And so, meaning there was a lot of market information that markets were gyrating on the China tariffs and on other tariffs, and there will be gyrating now as well. And yeah, it's quite an onerous and awesome responsibility to guide U.S. interests and to know that the world feels like, and from time to time, could come to an end.
So it sounds a little bit, so if I could reframe this in a more positive thing, it sounds as if the USDR may become important again. But and then I want to later on maybe go into Japan as collateral damage to this noise about Canada and Mexico, and so there's also that. But I wanted to start with the book. So first of all, I would like the audience to know this is a great book and it's written really well. There's some chapters that go into the weeds of something. You have to really be a trade person. But the larger picture is great, and I want to I'm in the introduction here as I want to underscore something you write there, that this is a longer term development, and
Yep.
you start out by explaining, and I thought this was really cool, that the Biden administration and U.S. Congress actually started this by challenging this idea of open trade as a good thing.
Mhm.
And then that was, I don't know when exactly that was, but then you said, and then came the Trump one, and they kind of did away with the most favored nation treatment, which is you give us something, I'll give you the same. And that kind of went out of the window. Then Biden uh kind of did away with the third core principle, which was the national treatment. That
Mhm.
is, if Japan produces a car in the United States, it's as good as a car that somebody else produces in the United States,
Mhm.
right? And that's kind of out of the window. And now we're at this thing about the dispute resolution where you can't even complain anymore, right? And so with that, you argue that we've dismantled the U.S. government, both sides, lots of different people, lots of different administrations have basically dismantled the system that America built to make the world a better place, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just to note, in the very beginning, you said Biden, but I think you meant Obama. But yes, that's the
Oh, I'm
story.
sorry that
That's okay.
yeah.
That's fine.
So it's a long thing, and this
Yes,
is
right,
not just about Trump. This is about America overall. And
right.
so I was thinking as I was reading it, and it's a really good book, and I recommend it. I was reading it, and maybe by my way by profession, I was thinking, okay, if I had to write a book review on this thing, how would I sound smarter than you do? It's beautifully written. It's
Thank
great,
you.
and I'm not a
My
trade person, so I'm
my
not smarter than you.
my proudest accomplishment, and this is hard to
Yeah.
write about trade in a way that it doesn't turn people off. I can assure you. My proudest accomplishment, actually, of that whole book is the very short list of acronyms.
Yes.
I did my very best to not add to the acronyms and make it as straightforward as possible.
And the other thing I'd like to congratulate you on is the decision to refer to this country as America.
Thanks.
It makes for better reading. I mean, the United States is technically the thing, or
Right.
U dot S dot is technically the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it is about America as we know now. It's also about USMAC and whatnot. So I want to congratulate you on that decision. Now, what I would, of course, say with a background as a business scholar and a global business scholar, I would say, well, you attribute this decline,
Mm-hmm.
this dismantling or whatever that is, to internal politics. And I was thinking, well, I would attribute it to the decline of the US manufacturing sector and the fact that we actually don't have very strong global, I mean, and I'm not talking Silicon Valley and the digital services and so on. I'm talking about cars and dishwashers and that sort of thing, and machine tools and then so US manufacturing. And then I started thinking about this. Okay, so what contributed to the dismantling of the US manufacturing powers? And so a lot of people in this country think that trade is the culprit, right? Trade is what did us in. And
Yep.
I think what did us in is Wall Street and this focus on finance and I'm giving money to shareholders rather than investing it in R&D and the whole long story about financialization, which is now covered, and those mistakes are covered up by some
Mm-hmm.
very sort of um, by trade policies that eventually will only hurt America more than help.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Is that? But that you don't quite say that. I'm putting words in your mouth here a little bit, but that
Well, no, there are so many external factors and that play into this. And right, I mean, I think one of the fundamental ones is the extent to which, the China shock obviously was an enormous issue, and I think a lot of people, particularly initially, kind of presumed that U.S. trade policy was changing to deal with that issue. And of course, it was enormous in its magnitude and its impact on U.S. communities. And the sense of helplessness, obviously, from those in those communities who lost their jobs, and some really just very difficult stories to listen to, but important stories. I think and the U.S. government being nowhere in sight to help, right? Or whatever assistance there was in trade adjustment assistance or whatever was just very tone deaf on the scope and the scale of what was going on. So Edward Alden has written a really good book on that, and I actually referenced it early in my book about that is a huge impact. I think your point is a really important one as well, Udike, which is what kind of system is the U.S. trying to promote, and where is it when it comes to supporting manufacturers? And traditionally, supporting manufacturers was viewed as coming through opening markets around the world. So the more open markets there are, we can compete. We have the best workers, and there's a sense of confidence in the workers and in the system and the rest. And I think it's fair to say, very fair to say that that system didn't pan out as fulsome as those that we're counting on it to pan out, we're expecting. And yes, I hear frequently, and I actually heard just here in Korea, but I think I won't name names, but there was a CEO, I saw a headline of a large Japanese corporation recently who the headline essentially said, America should leave the manufacturing to us. That is, that just really gets, and I think understandably so, those blood boiling in Washington, and particularly in those in the Trump and the Biden administration that feel very strongly that the U.S. should be playing this role, can play this role. First of all, they would object to that, so I won't give seed ground there. But even if you're correct, I think is what you would hear. Trade. I think they would point the finger at trade policy and open markets and the rest as having led to that. But these countries also have, generally speaking, have pretty sophisticated infrastructures to promote, support, advance their own manufacturing sectors, and to do better by trade in a much more strategic approach, which only is coming back into view now. So the question is, how do you get there? And the Biden administration's approach, of course, was to throw a lot of subsidies and government spending at the issue to bring it up, and with some certain degree of additional layers of export investment issues and the rest. Whereas the Trump administration's approach is obviously not to spend government money where possible. I think we all understand that now. It's very traditional Republican approach in that regard, but rather to use tariffs to do the same. So rather than spend all the money and government subsidies, we're just going to use tariffs basically to recreate, I think, what you have suggested has been, unfortunately lost, and not completely. America is still an enormously large manufacturing country, and the amount of manufacturing and the volume of manufacturing is still very high. And I just saw figures I think a couple hours ago that suggested that it's it's almost at an all-time high over the past couple of decades. So American manufacturing is still very alive and well, but it's the sense that the infrastructure, the resources, the talent, the drive, the momentum that you find, particularly in East Asia, obviously, but in other parts of the world, is missing, and the U.S. policy has failed that.
Yeah. So I mentioned the USTR, and I had one of your, I don't know, concurrent colleagues or successors, or Scott Wilbur on the Japan Zumina, and it was a really interesting conversation about what is the USTR doing. This is a couple of years ago, and I walked away from that conversation and said, well, he mentioned human rights, which I thought was interesting at one level, and of course, very important as we talk about supply chains and sustainability, and ESG and SDG and so forth. But it didn't sound like the old USTR of the 1980s or 90s, where Charlie Barshevsky would walk into Tokyo and say, "Let's do it my way or our way." That thing. I mean, I was remembering her, being one of the big players at the time. It didn't sound like that, but I'm wondering whether the USTR is going to get a second wind out of this, actually. I mean, or what is the future of the USTR? Do we not need it anymore? I mean, what? I hope
Wow.
not. And this is a larger question, right? So is the world coming to an end? I mean, where are we going with this?
Well, I will assure you we need it more than ever, but the question really is what its mission is and what the directive is. And USTR is a special place for a ton of reasons. And one of those reasons is that the political guidance is immediate and quick. Literally, I would just go downstairs, one floor, walk down the stairs, and then walk down the hall, and I would have my political guidance. And just enormously effective in that regard. Right. So I think USTR was very eclipsed, obviously, in the last administration because trade was, everything was being done to avoid upsetting political constituents that were important to the Democratic Party and for electoral prospects for the last election. That didn't work out. But nonetheless, in the Trump first administration, I mean, USTR was extremely influential agency, and because the president made trade a highly important issue, and so on a daily basis, pretty much, I had a very clear sense of what the temperature was on where we're going today, and that could change pretty radically and pretty directly. And Ambassador Lighthizer influence in the administration just skyrocketed. And of course, we had processes and we had, trade ultimately constitutionally is a matter for Congress. But over time, they've delegated quite a lot of authority to the executive branch because they were trying to take the politics out of it, which they knew they couldn't control themselves. But here we are back in a very political moment on trade. And that nonetheless, his influence with Congress and relationships in Congress were very strong. His relationship with the president was very strong. And so USTR was, I think of all the 16 years I was at USTR, that period of time was where USTR, I had to worry about the fewest issues with other agencies in the United States because USTR is very much on top of the world. I think that's where it will be headed again.
So we're getting some great questions from the audience. So I want to bring our friends in. Martin has a question that is very much, in my interest box here. The digital service trade deficit. So let me just say a word on that. So we all know that Japan imports a ton of energy. I mean, basically all of its energy needs, right? And so we all understand that that's a big reason why Japan has run a trade deficit for, the years after Fukushima and the earthquake and whatnot. Since last year, Japan's digital services imports are even larger than its energy imports. Basically, paying AWS and Microsoft for cloud centers, right? To put it in a very simplified way. That's astounding, right? If you think about how much energy Japan actually imports. So, Martin would like to know whether that matters and what can Japan argue with. I mean, that's a dependency, right? That's humongous. What can Japan offer? How can Japan sort of make sure that is not cut off or tripled in price, or is there actually a way to cut some deals, right? We're importing all the digital services. Does it offer some chips that Japan can use to appeal to the US? I mean, any thoughts on this sort of new thing, this new trade category?
Right. Well, I think this will just become even more of an issue as AI, the services part of AI just explodes because the U.S. is a leader here. I think it's fair to say the Trump administration did deeply understand and appreciate the importance of this, the U.S. IT sector. I don't even know what to call it now because it's everything, right? It's a sector was in for its own competitiveness and for jobs and for markets and everything. And they did, I think really support as they could. And there were some exceptions, and I won't go into it here, but by and large, to really support its growth and competitiveness. And we did actually an agreement with Japan in the context of this tariff agreement. There was a separate agreement negotiated at the same time on digital trade. And so the US and Japan came up with a digital trade agreement. So we have an agreement with Japan that sets the rules for digital trade. And it was state of the art at the time. It was basically very, very similar agreement to the one that was a chapter in the USMCA negotiation and that was approved by Congress. This was done separately, not approved by Congress, which was an issue later for some. But that was a more traditional trade rules-based approach sort of initiative that, and Japan really, in the United States, really were very aligned on what those rules should be. The U.S. model, the EU has a kind of a different approach and model. The U.S. model is generally seen favorably in much of Asia, obviously not China. Korea is more complicated. There are exceptions, but the Singapores, in Asia Pacific, I should say, because the Australias, the New Zealands, the Japans, and others were much more in alignment with the U.S. So we have rules of the road that are there for the sector to be able to continue to expand. The Biden administration, even though Democrats in Congress approved the digital chapter when they approved USMCA, were extremely upset and angry about the Japan deal. And they hated it. They thought it was just a gift to big tech rather than a sober sort of rules of the road kind of agreement that was in the U.S. interest. And so, they pretty much spent a lot of time trying to pick it apart. And then in the IPEF, I think they were, we haven't seen what the outcome of that was, but it was going to have a digital chapter, which would have been, I think, quite dramatically different than what you would have seen in the USMCA chapter. But this is a perfect example of what I mean by all these domestic disagreements, really predominating. And so you have the Trump administration building on USMCA, building on past US practice, building on the status quo, if you will, if you want to be more critical of it. And then to help the sector, and then the Biden administration came in and just wanted to, erase those fundamental tenets of that because it was a gift to big tech, and this is a zero-sum world of, not letting big tech win, whatever it, for whatever reason. And now you have the Trump administration coming back, so we'll see where they go. But I think they'll take the more traditional route with certain, differences.
So we have a number of questions, how Japan might suffer from sort of fallout. And, I would, if I had to put it in just one sentence, the confusion of China and Japan, or what we saw with the Nippon Steel, US Steel discussions and so forth. Scott invites us, and he has a specific way of asking this, so I read the question. So, since Japan will no longer benefit from Prime Minister Abe's relationship with Trump, how exposed is Japan to the risk of being singled out for special tariffs, just like China, Mexico, and Canada? Should we feel comfort that Japan's average tariffs outside of agriculture are quite low and lower than that of the United States? And then there's another question, if I could just tag that on to while you think. Phil wonders, to what degree is economic trade primarily a tool of statecraft that is a broader grounding for geopolitical balance of power, right? So is this gonna could this all blow up for Japan, I guess, is what both of them are wondering. And So what do we need to worry about?
Right. Well, that brings up so many different
Sorry,
things in my
I'm
mind.
throwing
No,
it all in. So
no, that's fine. No,
we have
but
more questions. So
of course, yeah, no, I'll try and keep this shorter just to really get to it. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think Japan is probably in a little more precarious situation this time than it was last time. I am knowing Japan well. I'm positive they are doing everything they can, maneuvering in ways that would be probably get them pulled over on the highway to for for trying to find hooks and try and manage the situation. So the Japan project, I think, when it comes to the Trump administration, is trying to figure out a way to manage America in one way or another, which is a dangerous thing sometimes because it can come across as feeling like you're being managed, and that's a concern. But I do think that over time the issue of universal tariffs or whatever that is, the issue of the trade deficit and its costs, quote unquote, to the United States. Sorry, economists, or some economists, I should say, there are others who see it differently, will they'll have to face that. And they did actually in the first Trump administration. They really tried to avoid doing a tariff agreement with the US for a long time. And then eventually it was forced on them. And that's, episode is mentioned in the book as well. But obviously Japan is also very concerned, as the second question, about the loss of the rules-based system. This is a very common theme with other countries across the world. What is America doing? And everyone wants their exceptions, but it turns out when America wants its exceptions, everyone is like, well, wait a minute, like, where are you? And so there's a long history there and balance of interests that goes on. But even just words like statecraft and geopolitical are just words that the Trump administration just despises because they see this all as a matter of in a much more transactional, much more zero sum, I should say, much more balance sheet kind of approach. So you're winning or you're losing, and your relationship with different countries is a gauge of that. And so in order to, that's why issues like the trade deficit or currency, currency alignment or the rest are the metrics of this new kind of zero sum system of winning or losing. And I think but Japan, Korea, the importance of the middle powers here in particular, I think, in trying to maintain the system while the U.S. goes off and does its own thing, and while Europe is kind of, they have their carbon border adjustment mechanism tariff or tax, but it's a tariff, essentially a system that's in place. So as these kind of things get divided, the old system, it's really interesting. And I do say this very specifically in the book, just as the US was walking out on TPP and the rules-based, the high standard rules-based, vision, Japan, was walking in on that system and really saw that as the future and agreed to a lot of rules that it would never have agreed to previously because it wanted to anchor itself in that system. So Japan is very invested in that and wants to see it maintained.
So the news of the day, of course, is that by February 1, we'll know whether the new administration will slap, tariffs of 25% on Canada and Mexico, which, if I understand it correctly, would be a violation of the US MAC, which used to be known as NAFTA.
Mm-hmm.
The NAFTA thing, if I remember it correctly from the early 90s, was actually just happened at the same time as the very vitriolic US-Japan trade negotiations. And so in a way, Japan lost that battle, but won the war in a funny way because Japanese companies engaged in this humongous and long-standing FDI in manufacturing into the maquiladoras here and in Canada. And then that fulfilled the local content rules under NAFTA, right? So that's still in place, right? So Japanese companies have huge manufacturing facilities within NAFTA, US MCA, is it? MAC, keep forgetting the
That's fine. USMCA, but that's fine.
MCA. I'm sorry. So is what is the risk here? I mean, to what extent will Japan feel the heat of all of that?
Right. Well, to the extent that, so it's not Japan directly, obviously, but it's Japanese corporations operating in other markets. Right. So yeah, it's coming. I mean, the tariffs are coming. The big bang that everyone was kind of getting ready for yesterday didn't quite materialize, but they were paving the way, and I have a lot I can say about this, but let me just cut to the chase when it comes to the Mexico Canada tariff threat mention. When I saw the 25%, this was originally announced quite a number of weeks ago, and as someone who really I think has kind of seen the inside of the thinking of the first Trump administration, I had a pretty good sense. And so I'll make a prediction here, and you can tell me in 6 months, or maybe even 3 months,
You come back. Yeah.
if I'm right or if I'm wrong. And if I'm right, feel free to follow me, I guess. Or is that what people say now? I don't know what the transaction is anymore.
We can
if
follow
I'm wrong,
you on X.
You can unfollow me, right? Or whatever it is today. But in this world, 25% seems a very high rate. And I view it this way. The first Trump administration, and actually Lighthizer writes this in his own book, he realized, I should say, not they, he realized, and wrote it later, that the taking the action on Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs as the first tariff action in the first administration, which then caused retaliation from the EU in particular, and really was a bit of a political defeat or a political problem for the first administration in convincing Americans that tariffs were a wonderful thing. The Section 301 tariffs, if you look at the polls, say, with China, basically the public generally supported whatever tariff with China, because there was a sense that was just a separate and difficult and problematic case. But other tariffs were kind of popular. President Trump's doing it or whatever, and then really fell off. The support really fell off as the retaliation came. And I think we're going to see this in Trump 2.0. So my guess, because the focus was on illegal immigration and fentanyl and the rest, so they're having to make a sales pitch here. This is my prediction. And the sales pitch is that the tariff tactic, threatening tariffs on even your allies and your neighbors, is a way to negotiate improvements from those countries, whatever they are. I didn't realize we had an immigration or fentanyl problem with Canada. leave it that way. But nonetheless,
you think it's not going to happen?
No. So this is the whole thing. So I think that you get an early win, right, in negotiating something that improves a really concern for a lot of Americans, and then but it's never going to be enough. And so you go from 25%, you cut a deal, and you go down to 10% maybe, and we're just going to watch and see how this goes. But that is the new rate. But that is to try and get the political support for the tariffs and the tactic and the tool, and then
maybe some quiet exemptions.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, right. And there will have to be some exemptions of some kind. So we'll see what goes there. But overall, I think the goal is reinstating a universal tariff of some kind with different terms and conditions, but not going back to zero, essentially, with Canada and Mexico. And so I think that is what we're seeing, and why we didn't see a day one tariff action, because they want to have a quick negotiation. And then we'll see, right, and then kind of build support for the tactic, and then start with others.
Yeah, you'll have a lot of followers, I think. so I have 3 questions I want to pack in. We have 6 minutes, so it's lots of time. But the first one could actually be a yes/no one. Okay. Do you think, Mark wonders, do you think there's a potential majority in Congress for a new trade law like Smoot-Hawley?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And what would that mean?
Potential. Well, the word is potential.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I think that obviously, because this delegation of authority from Congress to the executive branch that I mentioned, and then stretching that way beyond what anyone imagined, which is, what the Trump, basically that's kind of their brand, right? The Trump administration. is yeah, I think that ultimately, while the administration has whatever legal hook they can take to implement tariffs, I think ultimately what they would like to see from the Republican majorities now in both Congress, in both houses, both um, chambers, is for them to step forward and to pass and to implement a new universal of some kind baseline tariff with the world. So that means blowing up all of our FTAs. That means blowing up the WTO and our commitments to the WTO. That is the end, basically, of the post-war system that President Roosevelt had a vision for.
Yeah. All right, two more questions. The first is negative, and that's why I want to end on Danielle's more positive one. So Michael wonders, from today forward, what is the biggest risk that Japan faces with the United States vis-a-vis trade? Interesting one. And then Danielle, I'll let you do that first, and then
sure. I mean, just briefly, obviously, and here I am in Seoul, and everyone in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia feels very squeezed and concerned about where, they have relationships with China. They have to have relationships with China. Literally, China's fine dust is blanketed Seoul. And if I were to open the curtains, it would be as dark right now at daytime as these curtains are. So it's real, and China is a problem and an opportunity for companies here, but also a real challenge. So I think it's this sense of trying to manage the relationship between the U.S. and the relationship with China effectively and not get caught in a very undesirable moment.
Yeah. So it's not like, another tariff on rice or something. It's actually the larger.
Oh, there's so many other things, but I think the bigger picture is that.
Yeah. And I think that's actually the biggest challenge for the United States, that if Japan says, the United States is too unreliable, we want to make friends in Northeast Asia and forget it. So on a happy note, I hope we can end. Danielle asks, because she says, no serious policy question, Michael. Says, do you have any favorite memorable USTR negotiation stories with Japan you didn't get the opportunity to share in your book? And I think that's a perfect question, Danielle. Thank you so much, because this is all a pretty negative and frightening thing. And so you're putting Michael on the spot here. Any favorite memorable USTR moment where that you can share with us?
Well, USTR people are very motivated to fight for U.S. interests. I mean, it's really true. Like this is our bread.
That's your job, right? That
was our job. Yeah, that was it. And I really just feel so proud to have had that opportunity. So yeah, okay, I'll go there. I think literally the very moment that in our negotiation with Japan that we on tariffs, it was a very limited agreement, basically to reestablish agriculture access in Japan that was lost from withdrawal from TPP. Also, that was maybe one of my least favorite moments, was having to deliver the letter to Japan to withdraw from TPP. So that was a memorable moment.
That? Oh,
yes. Well, I didn't sign it, but I had to deliver it. Was when we finished the tariff agreement with Japan, and autos wasn't included. And I remember very well that moment with the two ministers and how that all went down. And it was so that's kind of dark, actually, maybe from a Japan perspective. From a USTR perspective, mission accomplished.
Yeah. But so that was memorable. But so in a way, that's interesting that your most memorable moment is one where you had to do something you didn't want to do.
Well,
I was hoping for a funny thing where
oh my goodness. Oh, there's so many. Yeah. I mean, I would just end on this. Japanese trade officials and bureaucrats, I really have tremendous respect for them. They really up my game, because just so high level internationally in terms of their approach, their tactics, their techniques. And it made me always have to be the very best in order to be an effective trade official for U.S. interests. So I do have tremendous love and respect, and I have many former Japanese counterpart colleagues who I have great relationships with. I mean, we all remember those days.
So I heard that actually from the two guys who did the 20% semiconductor agreement in the old days. That was really vitriolic and hard, right? That was not fun. And both of them remember each other. And when they're in Washington or Tokyo, they actually go and see each other because they managed to to separate the issue from the people. And they realized that the people that we're negotiating with are
Yes. Yeah. I mean, when you're in it, yeah, when you're in it, of course, it can be pretty tense and ugly. I mean, kind of at moments, but you know, there's a greater appreciation that comes later from that whole experience.
So unfortunately, time is up, and there's more to talk about. So Michael, let's do this. If your prediction is correct, and we're out of the WTO and whatever world organizations we're gonna get out of, we'll bring you back and let you forecast what's gonna happen next. So thank you.
Clean up the damage.
Yeah. Thank you, audience. It was great to have you, and I'll see you next on February 21st, so in 4 weeks from now, to discuss Japan's reemergence. Until then, stay safe and be all well. And thank you, Michael Beeman, for joining me today.
Farewell from Seoul.